So what's the best ISO setting for your camera? ISO 100, right? Well, maybe not. How about Auto ISO? Stick around. So most cameras now have an ISO setting called Auto. So when you're setting your ISO to 100, 200, 400, there's another option where you can set it to Auto ISO. And I've been using this a lot more lately, and I'm really getting used to it. I'm really loving how it works. So I know we talk about having more control over your camera settings and your images, which requires, getting out of automatic mode and handling your own aperture and shutter speed and ISO, which are the basic components of exposure. But Auto ISO really isn't giving up any control. It's kind of you alongside your camera basically telling you what you want it to do. So I'll explain. The number one reason when I'm changing my ISO is because my shutter speed ends up being too slow. So if I'm on a tripod, it really doesn't matter what my shutter speed is. I can shoot really long exposures. It doesn't matter if it's dark, if it's light. I can let my exposure be as long as I want. But if I'm hand holding the camera, I need my shutter speed to be fast enough so that I don't have any motion blur or camera shake creating a blurry image. I want a nice sharp image. So in order to have a nice sharp image, you need a fast enough shutter speed so that the little bit of movement you have when you're holding it, or sometimes a lot of movement, will be frozen along with your image. So in order to maintain a fast shutter speed, you have to control your other exposure elements, meaning your aperture and your ISO. So I'll find in a lot of situations when I'm composing an image, and right before I take the shot, I'm looking at my settings and I see, well, okay, my shutter speed is too slow. If I'm shooting, the rule of thumb is basically you want your shutter speed to be the same as what your focal length is or faster. So if I'm shooting with a 100mm lens, I want my shutter speed to be 1/100th of a second or faster. If I'm shooting with a 35mm lens, I want my shutter speed to be 1/40th of a second or faster. It's a rule of thumb. You can probably shoot slower than that and get away with it, but that's just kind of a guideline. So if I'm shooting with my 50mm lens, let's say, and it's sunny conditions and I'm getting shutter speeds of 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second, I know it's fine. It's fast enough. I'm going to freeze motion. I'm not going to have any camera shake. If I'm noticing that maybe it's getting darker out, maybe I go inside and I'm shooting with my 50mm lens and my shutter speed is now 1/15th of a second or 1/10th of a second, there's a pretty good chance that I'm not going to be able to hold it steady enough to avoid camera shake. So what I'll do in those situations is I'll just bump my ISO up to 200 or 400, and that'll get me from 1/15th of a second up to 1/60th of a second, where I know I'm kind of safe. But what if I'm shooting rapidly, things are changing, I'm chasing action, and I really don't have time or don't want to be distracted by my ISO and having to change that setting? It doesn't take a lot of time, but it's just something else that you have to think of. And to have to rely on yourself in the moment, keeping track of your shutter speed and knowing what it is when you're chasing something around or shooting something that's moving, you really want as much automatic to be as possible. So again, we don't like to give up control over our exposure elements, but using Auto ISO really isn't giving up any control. So here's how it works. In Auto ISO, you're telling your camera that you want the lowest ISO possible for the slowest shutter speed that you'll accept. So in your camera settings, there will be a menu for your Auto ISO settings. And in there, you can tell it what you want your slowest shutter speed to be. You can go in and say, okay, I don't want my shutter speed to be any slower than 1/200th of a second. You can change it to any shutter speed you want, 1/5th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, whatever you want that to be, that's what you're telling your camera. So now your camera knows that it's going to try to shoot at ISO 100. If the shutter speed drops below what you told it, if the shutter speed in this case drops below 1/200th of a second, the camera knows you don't want to go any slower than 1/200th of a second. So it's going to, from there, bump your ISO up in little increments to get you an acceptable shutter speed. So if my shutter speed now was going to drop down to 1/100th of a second, in order to get it back up to 1/200th of a second, it knows it has to double my ISO up to 200. So it's just going to automatically change it to 200. So I know that I can't shoot any slower than 1/200th of a second. So I really don't care what my ISO is, because I'd rather get the shot sharp than worry about noise in my picture. And again, any shutter speed that you want to use, if you want an even slower shutter speed, you can do that. And what the camera will do is it'll keep increasing your ISO as conditions keep getting darker. Now, if you're shooting, let's say, a parade where things are different, brightness is naturally, or they're moving in and out of shadows, or you're outdoor shooting, some action, your kids are running around playing, or you're in conditions where the exposure is changing, or you go from inside to outside, or even inside on like a dark ride, let's say, and each scene is varying brightness. You don't necessarily want to have to worry about your ISO all the time, because if your shutter speed is locked into what you want it to be, no slower than 1/50th of a second or whatever that is, then your camera's just going to adjust the ISO automatically. And what happens is, I don't want a high ISO necessarily with a lot of noise in it, but I'd rather get a high ISO shot than get a shot that's just going to be blurry anyway, and I can't use it because there was too much camera shake involved, and now it's too blurry and I got to throw it out. I'd rather take a chance on a grainier image at a high ISO than not getting the image at all. So when I set it to auto ISO and I tell it what my lowest acceptable shutter speed is, it's just going to keep increasing my ISO until it gets to, the maximum on my Canon EOS R is 25,600 ISO, and it's going to just keep increasing my ISO all the way up to that. When it hits that level, there's nothing it can do. It can't keep increasing the ISO. So then it's actually going to just let the shutter speed decrease beyond my limit, because there's nothing it could do at that point. So, those are kind of extreme conditions, but it's going to do whatever it possibly can do to keep your ISO as low as possible. Now, I've used this recently in the past few months in a lot of different conditions. It's really great. It's not going to increase your ISO any more than it needs to. So if your ISO is 100 and it needs to increase it to 125 or 160, that's as far as it's going to go. It's not going to shoot it all the way up to 800 if you don't need it. And then, if you need a faster shutter speed, it'll just match it accordingly with that. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that changing from one condition to another, if you're going to stay in auto ISO, you have to remember to change your slowest acceptable shutter speed. So, for example, if you're shooting something with some fast motion and you want to be able to freeze it, so your lowest shutter speed is 1/250th of a second, that's fine. But now if you go on to shooting something else, say you go indoors and you're going to shoot some still life stuff where your shutter speed can be slower because it's not moving around, the camera in auto ISO is going to keep trying to keep it at that 1/250th of a second, where you don't necessarily need that in those conditions. So you have to go in and make sure that you change it to the slower, lowest acceptable shutter speed in those conditions. So it's just something else to keep in mind. But in the moment, when you're shooting in the moment in those conditions and you don't want to be distracted by having to change a different setting or slowing down to, possibly missing a shot because your shutter speed is too slow, and then maybe you miss that one moment, auto ISO works really great. I've tried it. I'm getting used to it. I don't like giving up control, but you're really not giving up control because you're telling the camera what you want it to do and just letting it take care of the rest. So try it out. It's definitely worth it. Try it out in some different conditions. You'll see it works really great. I'm going to put up a couple of links to videos here. One that we did on understanding ISO a while ago, and another one here that you might enjoy also. So check those out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.